Good evening, everybody. It's I, Nick, Pennsylvania, here as always with my good friend Brendan Bond. How are you this evening, Brendan?
I'm doing excellent, thank you, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing real good myself. I'm actually in a very comfy chair, so the normal squeaky chair that people have endured from me is no longer, at least not for this evening. I might bring it back. But I'm in a different room. I'm feeling good. It is a nice summer evening. There are always storms on the horizon, and it is just a perfect evening for being upstairs in a library, so that's where I'm at right now. Speaking of libraries, I do want to say Bond has orchestrated a couple interviews with some of our favorite authors. So a couple different interviews are coming up. I don't want to say any names just yet because we've had interviews set up in the past. This has been a while in the works and life gets in the way. So I don't want to get anyone too excited, but I will say one of the authors has done an amazing book on witch lore in our neck of the woods. And it was only the other week that I and a stranger met for the first time, and we were each citing that book. And the other author is Canadian, and I was unfamiliar with them until you actually just lent me a book, which I have hostage right here in my hand, and I need to get back to you when I see you soon. So thank you for that. A bit more about not only from writing from Canada and Canadian happenings, but also a bit of the Fae folklore, which is something that you've always been much more familiar and express interest in than I have. So it was interesting to read about that. So I'm not going to say the authors' names yet, but you can look forward to those. The next couple episodes should have at least one of those interviews, and I am very, very excited for that. But for this evening, again, we wanted to touch base and let everybody know to brace themselves for that. It'll be very exciting. It'll be get your library, your bookstore order agenda set for the next few reading nights. But Bond also has a story. Might be a little bit of a brief one, but I'm just going to hand things over. I have not heard any of this. Apparently, this is a recent occurrence for the Bigfoot files.
Yeah, this is a fresh one. The story I want to relay to you, Nick, and to everyone out there listening tonight. This story is from my parents. Previously, I have alluded to some things that have happened in my life and in my parents' lives and everything, as far as just like odd happenings, around our family here and there. But this is something that is, like you mentioned, Nick, is Bigfoot related, which is not something that I think my parents have ever had to really deal with before. I'm just going to go ahead and get into it. So, and I do have permission to relay this story. I want to be clear about that. This isn't me just speaking secondhand or anything. So, a few weeks ago, my parents were on a bike trip up in north central Pennsylvania. They're big fans of the rails to trails system that is really prevalent here in Pennsylvania. I know it's other places in the East Coast, but basically these are old railroad tracks that have been converted to bike trails. So as a result, they are relatively flat, usually pretty well maintained, not necessarily easy rides, but very accessible. And they go through some of the most beautiful locations in the Commonwealth. This one was no different. So they were riding on a trail that goes between Brockway and Ridgeway. You're familiar. I know you're very familiar with the area. We have fished up there. We have camped up there.
It's one of the counties two of the counties that for work I have to go to quite frequently. Yeah.
Right. These are areas that I would say in the last, I'd say 15, 20 years have seen a bit of an uptick in recreation due to things like these bike paths.
Due to the bike paths, and I would also add just the water quality. And again, you and I have talked about this a whole heck of a lot. This was an area that was really the nature was really plundered. I mean, this was an era that I think I've mentioned here before, part of the brush heap, because it was just so heavily forested And forestry timber continues to be a major
Mm-hmm.
product today in the area, but they just clear cut that. So from like basically from World War One, all the way into the early 1950s, a lot of the towns in these regions were at constant risk of brush fire, and in fact, some of the
Mm-hmm.
towns faced major losses to that. So between the lumber industry, between the mining, there was so much pollution and damage to the natural environment that it really has come to a renaissance, and the first generation of new forests is starting to give way to even
Right.
age management.
Right. And as a lot of these small towns transition from forestry and industry and into recreation commerce and things like that, you see the forest and the natural areas rebounding accordingly now that people are taking care of them and realizing that they are worth a lot more if they're kept in good shape.
20 years ago, how many kayakers did you see on the
Right.
Allegheny
Right.
compared
Exactly.
to
Compared
today?
to now. Yeah. So.
All of these rivers and everything. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that until
Hmm.
you pointed out. But yeah, there's definitely been a major resurgence in outdoor activities. But, I mean, 20 years ago or more, if you said outdoor activities, you were almost exclusively talking about hunting, fishing,
Right.
trapping.
Right. Exactly. And so biking is one of these industries that has taken an upturn. I think that there's a bit of a, like, for the flesh and blood Bigfoot crowd, you now have these trails going through areas that are by contiguous United States standards are still considered very remote. It's not hard to be somewhere where you are 10, 15 miles from anything that you would call a town.
Yeah, I have said it before, I'll say it again, but a lot of people would probably be very surprised to learn that the northern tier of Pennsylvania wasn't even fully mapped out until the 1920s. Wrap your head around that. We're an Atlantic
Mm-hmm.
state. We are that divide between the Atlantic states and the Midwest, between kind of New England and the southern. Like, we're at this crossroads, and one of the original settlements, and yet, yeah, not fully mapped out that region of Pennsylvania in particular until the 1920s.
Right.
It's pretty
So
wild.
yeah. So and the reason we're speaking about this, for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, I want to give you a good idea of the setting, because when I just say, oh, they were on a bike path that used to be a railroad track, that can conjure a lot of different imagery, and I want to let you know, like, kind of where they were at. So they're on this bike path, and they are, by most standards, in the middle of nowhere. They are well away from any even forest roads at this point. And it is, relatively early in the morning. They're out biking, having a good time, right along this nice little creek and everything. And it's, just enjoying the Commonwealth's nature. As they are biking, my father says that they hear up on the hill what sounds like someone hitting a stick or a log or something against a tree in a very slow but repetitive manner. And he said it caught his attention because after he heard it hit a few times, almost like with each time, with each hit, it almost got weirder and weirder, where it's like, that's because around here we have a lot of woodpeckers, a lot of different types of woodpeckers, and we're used to hearing what a woodpecker can sound like on different trees and everything.
Yeah, got two in the yard.
Yeah, he was very clear that, like, this was not a woodpecker; it was something hitting something against a tree.
Yeah, when you
Um,
say it, it sounds like it was something denser, kind of a deeper
yes,
sound.
yeah. So, and enough that they actually stopped, and he started to listen. And I looked at the area on the map, and he said that it was up this hill on their northeastern side, and he said he couldn't see anything, but he heard it, like, kind of continuing. Because he's a listener to this show, he was like, holy crap, that sounds like those wood knocks that they talk about.
Yeah, just was it one or two
Yeah.
episodes ago, we were reading different Bigfoot stories from our neck of the woods, and
Mm-hmm.
two of them, not only were they in the same location, but it was
But
almost the
talked about.
exact same story, and it's almost the
Mm-hmm.
same story what your parents have relayed to
Right.
you, it sounds like.
And the interesting thing is he stopped, and both of them heard him. My mother corroborated this. And believe me, if she didn't hear it, she would have said, like, I don't know what your dad said he heard, like, but
I'm worried about them.
right, but she corroborated it and everything. She heard it too. So my dad, thankfully, gets out his phone to try and record it because that's like what we always say, people never do,
Right.
is, and so he was trying to get the video function to work on his phone and everything, and he said whenever he raised the phone up in the air, you guys can't see me mimicking someone raising a phone over their head,
If
the
you could
knock,
imagine,
you
almost
can
like a person
imagine.
holding their hand above
Exactly.
their head.
He said when he did that, the knocking stopped, which is really kind of creepy.
Well, right, because it says immediately to me, this is something somebody is watching,
Watching
and
and
it's
reacting.
reacting.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the weird thing, is the idea that it's reacting. And again, if you subscribe to the flesh and blood theory of Bigfoot and everything, the idea, this is a trope basically, that a sentry Bigfoot is on top of this ridge watching this bike path, and when people come along, it signals to other ones. As soon as it realizes that the people are aware of it, it stops. You know, um, now looking at this location on a map, there isn't even a forestry road for miles on that side of the hill. There are what look to be some houses, maybe a mile or so to the west in the other direction, across the creek over another hill kind of thing. Not in a direction that they would be able to mistake the sounds for. And again, he said it sounded like something hitting against a tree, which, even if it would have been like a game lands or forestry person chopping down a tree, which they wouldn't do, no one's going to pay a forestry agent to chop down a tree when they could use a chainsaw. Um,
Right.
he
And
said
if he
he
would have
said it didn't
stopped,
sound like that, you
yeah.
know. So
And if he would have stopped, it would presumably because the tree was falling or something.
right, yeah, not and again, so the idea of it being a coincidence that it stopped whenever my dad reacted to it, again, that just shows that there could be some interaction going on.
Well, I'm hoping I'm not getting ahead of it here, but how long did your folks linger there to see if it would pick up again?
Not for too long, because my dad said it was kind of spooky. He said if they would have heard something crashing through the woods or whatever, they would have taken off. Because again, you're out there in the middle of nowhere. It's not like there's anybody else around. But the thing that I thought was, again, I think the whole thing is an interesting and kind of a spooky encounter that I can really imagine myself going through. But the thing that he said that I thought was interesting was, he said that I'm not sure if he would have recognized it for that if he hadn't have listened to our episodes. And that brings us back to what we talk about with the idea of priming and the idea of your cultural expectations are imprinted one way or another over these interactions and perceptions that we have in the woods. And I think wood knocks are one of those things where there's lots of possible mundane explanations, but if you know that that's something that you might be looking out for, and you start ticking through those boxes of, like, it's not a woodpecker, it shouldn't be a person, it doesn't sound like a natural sound, then you're going to get to, this is something anomalous, quicker than maybe someone else who wouldn't even think twice about it, because, like, oh, it's just a few knocks in the woods, who cares?
Yeah, you're not going to assign any sort of importance to it because it's going
Right.
to blend in with all the other sounds. Like when
Mm-hmm.
you stop, and I know this is kind of one of those like Zen type things they train you to do, which is just kind of turn off and try to be as silent as you can be. And it's amazing just how much sound you're being bombarded with because
at
You
all
tune
times.
so much out, right? I've been looking and learning a lot about urban planning and zoning and things like this. And there's a statement that I heard that really sunk in with me. And ever since then, it's all I can hear. And the statement is that cities are not loud, automobiles are loud. And now I've become very aware of that fact, so much so that I feel like, going on a walk with someone and talking and having to stop and wait for some vehicles to pass by because you can barely think when they go by. I feel like prior to hearing that statement, I was able to tune so much of that out.
Right.
But you just become so aware.
Yeah, and it's funny you say, because I mean, as someone who edits podcasts every week, I feel like I am hyper aware too of how loud places are, because even just in all the recording engineering that we have done over our careers, for the last 15, 20 years, think of how many times we didn't hear something, but then we go back and listen to a recording, we're like, oh crap, like the fans were on. No one else is going to be like, oh, those fans are loud,
right?
But we hear it,
Or even when you get buried anomalies, when you get a train passing by,
right.
And from a place where we used to do recordings, the train tracks were a mile away,
right?
And you would never hear it. You would have to be listening to it so loud. But when you're in that mixing and production phase of things, and you hear all these tiny little things, and that's kind of like what life is. You have to kind of fade down the sounds of your thoughts and everything, and you realize just how loud silence is. There's no silence.
Right. And I think that that's something that people experience whenever they're, going out to these kind of wild places, in this case, in our Commonwealth and our places, different states and national forests and things. You're in a different setting that even if you consider yourself like an outdoorsy person, like a lot of us do, it's not often that you're somewhere listening intently where there literally are no cars that you can hear. There are no planes. There's no helicopters. There's nothing. So you do have a heightened awareness beyond just the normal primal awareness of being like, okay, well, I'm in the wild, so I need to kind of like, pay more attention. So like, I wonder how much of, like again, if we're saying that Bigfoot is a flesh and blood creature that's in the woods, with people going to these regions more and more often now, coming from places where they're not used to hearing things, I wonder, and as the prevalence of shows like Finding Bigfoot and just the idea of wood knocks in these Class B encounters especially, as those become more popular, are we going to continue to see a uptick in the reporting or the experiencing of these phenomena, whether imposed, real or not?
Well, one of the things I wonder too is, again, could some sort of large animal in small numbers be in the forest, just haven't really been well detected? I guess. I'm not sold on it, but I guess. But one of the things that I challenge with that, and again, this is a story about your parents' experience, but just on the Bigfoot score, is when we began talking about this area, I mentioned how this had been, the wilds have been completely denuded. It was described in more than one place as looking like a lunar landscape. Where did they go? So if just for the sake of the argument, if this is a flesh and blood thing, the lumber era where the wood hicks and the wood ticks were running roughshod over the landscape, how was one, I mean, if their numbers are so low, they had to have left the area and returned.
Like, I think the flesh and blood thing is interesting. I'm by no means sold on it either. So going to the other end of the spectrum, if we look at this as a paranormal archetypal phenomenon, which a lot of folks subscribe to as well, and we've talked about especially with ghosts and things like that and UFOs. So if this is something that's happening if it's supposed to be something that we are projecting onto the world around us, and let's say this is something my dad, because they were listening to those episodes and everything, it was on his mind. He somehow projected that into the world around him. The fact that my mother was able to hear it as well is very interesting, because that means it's not a completely internal experience like some of these other ones might be explained by.
And did she respond the same way that your father did?
She said it was spooky. Yeah.
Okay.
She said it was spooky. Yeah. And that's the word they used, spooky. And I agree, because it's like it's just kind of unsettling,
Yeah, spooky. I think spooky is reserved specifically for things where you're unsure if there's any real threat, or if there's any real thing. It's just unsettling, because I think spooky is the word that you reserve for when you're not sure if this is a mind thing or a real thing. Yeah,
like it's like, is there danger here? I mean, luckily, thank God, they're okay. There was nothing bad happened, obviously. But it's weird, because usually, because again, I'm typically on, like I said, the side of the spectrum that thinks that a lot of this stuff is stranger and more paranormal than not. But this does have all those classic hallmarks of a flesh and blood, century style Class B, encounter. And I don't know, I think that's interesting, because I obviously 100% believe that they had this experience,
for sure.
It's not like there's any, someone listening to this might be like, oh well, they obviously were just, they heard this in the episode and misinterpreted something, and regardless of what actually was making that noise, it's still like a spooky encounter, like they said. And I think it's interesting how it does fit all these tropes, because like what I mentioned about the whole century thing is a big trope in Bigfoot encounters that they have never heard about. My dad is probably listening to this right now going like, like that's an interesting
You had to hold it to now to let him know.
And to be clear about what I'm saying about the whole century trope is, people say that in areas that have populations, and this is the word that these folks use, populations of resident Sasquatches, the adolescents or younger males, will basically be on guard duty around areas where they might expect people to be. And whenever they come across people, it's their job to signal to everyone else in an area through wood knocks, through whoops, through yells, howls, or whatever.
You can see a lot of animals do this. You can see ducks do this. There's always one
crows,
mm-hmm.
Yeah, corvids in general. Like, how many times have me and you walked into a piece of forest and the crows just go nuts because we're there?
A slice of forest, even,
right. So again, that's where that kind of precedent comes from. But that is a trope in Bigfoot lore, and that's not something that they would have known before this. So I think that adds a little bit of it's just like that's another wrinkle in it. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it's another story from your parents who have had a couple interesting episodes lately. I think they're hearing a bit too much from you.
Probably.
And it's starting to creep them out everywhere they go.
That's literally every person in my life. Same thing. Get a little creeped out by these stories, Like I do think, again, with if there is a co-creative element to this stuff, you hear from that from people all the time, where if you are into something and thinking about something, you're more likely to see it. That's specifically called what's called, I believe it's pronounced the Bader-Meinhof syndrome.
Maybe
it's something like that, where it's
something like that.
Yeah, it's something along. Yeah, and how it was originally described to me is if you're thinking about buying a new vehicle, thinking about I don't know, Jeep Cherokee. Suddenly, every third car you see on the road is a Jeep Cherokee.
Oh, see, I had something similar. I used to always, this is back in the day when cable TV or broadcast TV, before when programming still existed, because you had to be there unless you were going to work with the VCR. I would see an episode of a TV show, and then I wouldn't see that TV show for like 3 months. And when I would turn the TV on, that show was on. It was the same episode I'd last seen.
Stuff like that.
That happens so frequently, and I talked to people back then, and they would have the same experience. It was just one of those weird incidents,
right? And you're right. And it does have that does get into the confirmation bias, because
sorry, real quick, when you learn about something in school or something, or you learn about something for the first time, then suddenly it too is everywhere, like your Jeep Cherokee.
Right. And people say that happens with the paranormal. And some of it might be because, like, okay, well, you're tuned into this stuff, so you're more likely to experience it. But there's also those two psychological elements that we just mentioned that are probably at play too. I just think that's something to kind of consider with these things, because I do hear that from people that, like, for instance, like since we've started this podcast, I have had many more people in my life that are into these kind of stories and folklore and ghosts and whatever, reach out to me with their stories. It's not because people are having more experiences than they were previously, but that could confuse my perception of the amount of things that are happening out there. Because in my head, I'm like, oh, well, I get, 2-3 messages a week from people saying like, oh, I had this weird thing happen, or I saw this thing, where that didn't happen 5 years ago. But that's just because of my perception and my relationship to these other people. It's, it kind of gets into the existential and phenomenological elements of life. But I think those are the things you kind of have to consider when looking at cases like this. I haven't actually looked yet, but I do want to look in that area and see if there are other stories,
I bet you there are.
I'm sure there are.
We were surprised to see how many were in our area, and I think we had made some comment on that in our Reading Bigfoot Tale episode. There goes a loud vehicle right now that will be picked up in my audio. But yeah, it's in your example, one of the things to think about, though, is the Jeep Cherokees were real. The knocks are real. But what's the source? Are we
the source is the question?
You're right. We're creating. So we're attributing.
That's
authorship.
That's the right. Yeah, we're attributing authorship. We're attributing sentience. We're imposing a story over reality that may or may not correlate to what's actually happening.